Hello everyone, my name is Zach Weiss, and I'm going to take you all through a brief survey of experimental philosophy and epistemology. My advisor is Walter Hopp, who's here. He's an associate professor of philosophy here at the philosophy department of Boston University. So just to take you through some quick terms, epistemology, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge and justified belief. It asks the kinds of questions like, what can we know? What does it mean to be justified in accepting a certain belief? And what sort of conditions have to be in place to talk about knowledge and justification at all? A recent trend within the discipline of epistemology is the use of thought experiments as counterexamples to existing theories. So rather than critique their opponents' theories by showing that they're logically inconsistent or perhaps that they rest on bad premises, philosophers will propose scenarios which meet all of the conditions of a given theory, but intuitively don't appear to be an example of the phenomenon the theory is trying to account for. An example of that in more recent philosophy would be Gettier cases, designed by this man, Edmund Gettier, that are designed to show that justified true belief is not a sufficient condition for knowledge. So arguments like these generally take the following form, which I call the argument from counterexamples. Namely, that if the analysis of a phenomenon is correct, we'll have an instance of that phenomenon if that instance has certain states. However, if you either have an instance of that phenomenon without those states, or you have something with all those states that isn't an instance of that phenomenon, then you have reason to believe that the analysis is wrong, namely that there's some sort of issue with the theory. However, philosophers in perfectly good faith could reject premise 2 on the grounds that it constitutes an appeal to people's intuitions. So, for example, somebody arguing against a Gettier case could simply bite the bullet here and say that, well, you can have your fancy scenarios, but as far as I'm concerned, that's still knowledge. This raises several interesting questions about the kind of biases philosophers might be bringing in when they design and propose these thought experiments. Biases that might arise from their own pet theories, from the fact that philosophy is largely a discipline of old white males reading dead white males, and any number of other factors. So it would be very helpful if we had some way to perform a check on these biases by comparing the intuitions philosophers have to those of the general population. And that's where experimental philosophy as a methodology comes in. It's loosely defined as the attempt to gather empirical data about philosophical problems by running surveys which test the intuitions that ordinary, perhaps non-philosophers have about them. Here you can see the burning armchair, which has kind of become the motif of the methodology. However, you can't really do anything in philosophy without responding to some objections. So I'm going to try and address a few of them here. The first couple show up in Joshua Knobe's and Sean Nichols' Experimental Philosophy Manifesto, and they more or less constitute objections from expertise. One of them is that philosophy is a specialized academic discipline, so just like physicists don't ask normal people about physics, philosophers really shouldn't ask normal people about philosophy. And that's an understandable objection, but one of the big problems with that is common sense intuitions towards philosophical problems are often what motivate those problems in the first place. And in the case of thought experiments, common sense intuitions towards those thought experiments often are what motivate the solutions that a philosopher is trying to propose. So we really should try and get more data on that. The other concern is that due to the special training philosophers get, they should be in a better position to intuit what the correct conclusion is that can be drawn from these thought experiments. So why even consult normal people? But I personally find very little reason to support this, because frankly, if they were better intuitors, you would expect there to be more consensus about the results of these thought experiments, and if anything, there's just more confusion. Now, another really strong set of objections comes from this particular argument from experimental philosophy formulated by a guy named Elijah Chudnoff in his book on intuition. I don't have time to walk you through it, but there's one very important conclusion that I want you to draw attention to. I did manage to reformulate his argument, and one of the things that is really important is that in his original argument, he mentioned something down around here in premises 3 and 4 with a conclusion called presentational phenomenology. It seems like when he makes these specifications, he's really concerned in grounding this argument in his own theory of intuition. I don't think when you're critiquing thought experiments that you necessarily need to do that. As long as you propose a survey which keeps track of all of the same variables that the philosopher proposing the thought experiment needs you to keep track of to begin with, you're on the same footing with the thought experiment, and your results stand and fall with that. So, having addressed a few objections, I decided that I would run a piece of experimental philosophy myself. So I conducted a brief survey based on the Moreian question proposed by this guy, G.E. Moore, in his essay, Hume's Theory Examined. G.E. Moore comes up with two rules, which he attributes to the skeptical philosopher David Hume right here, and claims that most philosophers who argue that skepticism is true, namely that we can't know anything about the external world, objects like chairs, other people, other minds, argue in the following way. If Hume's rules are true, then we can't know anything about the external world. Hume's rules are true, therefore we can't know anything about the external world. Moore wants to turn this argument on its head and say that if Hume's rules are true, we can't know anything about the external world, but we can clearly know things about the external world. Therefore, I have no reason to believe that Hume's rules are true. Now, while most people would say that this constitutes begging the question, Moore grounds it by saying statements about the external world, like, I know this is a pen, or I know I have a hand, constitute something called immediate knowledge. Now, I don't want to get too specific about what that is, but it's important to understand that for G.E. Moore, immediate knowledge is epistemologically basic. That means it's the kind of basic belief upon which our general knowledge about the world, about ourselves, is based on, and as such, it's prior to any sort of premises which could be used to get any kind of skeptical argument off the ground. Here's a version of Hume's rules. I wish you had time to read it, but if anything, it just means that, obviously I had to clean this up a little bit before I decided to test it as a survey. Now, I decided that if they're epistemologically basic, there's reason to believe that they should be more plausible when I submit it to general people, so that's more or less the shape that my survey took. Also, as I mentioned before, you have to take into account all of the different doctrines and ideas that a philosopher themselves are bringing into their thought experiment, which means that in the case of G.E. Moore, I had to take his indirect realism into account. Now, indirect realism is a school of epistemology that claims that you can't necessarily observe external objects directly. In Moore's case, that means that what you actually directly see is called sense data. So, for example, when I look at my hand, I see colors, I see shapes, I feel textures. When I snap my finger, I hear a sound. And from things like this, I infer the existence of an object like a hand. Now, this is the survey question that I eventually tested. I controlled for direct realism by saying, assuming this, and then I asked which of the following is more plausible. Either I know I have a hand, or two simplified versions of Hume's rules. Now, you can't just throw that question out at people without trying to set up some sort of controls about the relevant information. So these are the controls that I set up in my survey. I set up demographic controls, which were largely set to control for racial and ethnic background and gender. Education level, the survey was of the Boston University student population, so I just wanted to see where education-wise everyone was. Familiarity with philosophy, which took both an objective and a subjective component. I wanted to see both how many classes people had taken in the discipline, and on a scale of 1 to 10, I wanted people to relate their own familiarity with the subject matter. Reflectiveness is also something that needed to be taken into account because this is a delicate question and I didn't want people to just sort of stumble through the survey. There is, in the experimental philosophy literature that already exists today, a way of controlling for this. And these are the cognitive reflection tests, which have been used in previous surveys. There are 3 questions which basically work like trick questions. You read them, you think you know the answer, but upon closer reflection, you actually realize it's something else. And these are basically designed to make sure that the respondents are actively thinking and considering the subject matter when they answer the questions. And in the past, it has been shown to cut down on certain psychological biases in those surveys. Finally, I also wanted to add sympathy for direct or indirect realism. I've already mentioned indirect realism. Direct realism is the idea that when I look at a hand, I just see a hand. I wanted to see if this would perhaps be relevant at all to the way people answered the Moreian question. My hypothesis was that people were generally going to say they knew they had a hand. That although there might be some misunderstanding of the subject matter, or maybe I confused some people, or they just kind of breezed through it, about 70% of the population would agree with Moore. However, out of 260 respondents, only 56% agreed with Moore, which I can say with 95% confidence and in a 6% margin of error, which is still way, way, way below what I expected from my hypothesis. Now, some interesting things about the survey population that I feel I should mention. 58% were female, 41% male, and 1% other. 79% were between the ages of 18 and 21. 65% were white, 20% were Latino. That's probably personal bias given how I distributed the survey. But South Asian, East Asian, African American, and people of Middle Eastern descent were the remaining ethnic groups. 73% were undergraduate, 44% had no formal exposure to philosophy, and 47% had only taken 1 to 3 undergraduate courses. The average scale on 1 to 10 of familiarity with philosophy was a 3.81. So I was pretty confident that most people were thinking about the subject matter because 76% of my respondents answered the 3rd cognitive reflection test correctly. So at least they figured out that there was a trend that you were supposed to be thinking about this sort of thing. As far as sympathy for direct realism goes, 58% of the respondents sympathized with direct realism. 58% of respondents really thought, well, when I look at a hand, I see a hand. This was significantly lower than I thought. And interestingly enough, it was sympathy for direct or indirect realism which proved to have the strongest correlation with the answers to the Morean question. Of those who were sympathetic with direct realism, 67% actually agreed with Moore, which was much closer to my original hypothesis. Out of those who sympathized with direct realism and answered the 3rd cognitive reflection test correctly, that shot up to 76%, and out of the people who answered all 3, it wound up being 69%. Unsurprisingly, among the indirect realists, the percentages were significantly lower. 39% agreed with Moore overall. And among those who answered the 3rd question correctly, only 38%. The total with all 3 cognitive reflection tests did shoot up to 47, but overall that's still way below that 6% margin of error that I had mentioned earlier. So finally, having done a little bit of statistical work, having run my survey, the question is, what sort of conclusions could I draw? Well, unfortunately, any proponent of the Morean theory has to answer the fact that if you want to say these beliefs are basic, why are they not obvious? Why is there so much debate? And furthermore, why does there seem to be such a strong correlation between sympathy for direct and indirect realism and your opinions regarding this subject? If it's basic, shouldn't it be prior to any sort of quibbles about whether or not what you see is a hand or some sort of collection of sense data? So again, that's why I posted the classical foundationalism RIP, because generally speaking, a school of philosophy which considers basic beliefs to kind of be the building block of all our knowledge is in fact called foundationalism. So that was a lot of the conclusions that I managed to draw from my survey. Hopefully I explained all the subject matter correctly, and I don't think I have a lot of time left, but if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free. Any questions? Charles.
So, very interesting, unexpected. Nothing was very interesting, that was expected. Let me ask you this. What do you learn from experimental philosophy apart from the fact that people have beliefs which may or may not be justified? You make the point that they're not in accordance with philosophical doctrines, but because many philosophical doctrines fly in the face of common sense knowledge, should we be surprised? And whether surprised or not surprised, how does this really affect philosophical reasoning?
Well, it's been mentioned that the way that a lot of philosophical problems are characterized largely rise as a response to common sense intuitions and notions about certain problems of morality, of epistemology, of ethics, of ontology. And it would be incredibly helpful to get, at the very least, a feel for some of those problems by running out and doing the research, by seeing exactly how they show up as problems for us in the real world. And finally, with the case of thought experiments, there seems to be a claim that when you hold all of these variables in mind, there's a certain solution that you should be getting. You should have an intuition towards the kind of answer that the creator of the thought experiment is proposing. And that may not necessarily be the case. And once again, as I said before, there's the concern that the guy proposing the thought experiment has certain biases that need to be tested, that need to be compared. At the very least, let's get a benchmark.